He was 62 when the world finally heard the words he had carried for a lifetime. I truly hated her. A sentence so brief, yet it cracked open decades of silence. A confession steeped in pain, misunderstanding, and memories too heavy to name. For Julian Lennon, that statement was not about anger alone. It was the echo of a childhood spent in shadows. A life lived behind the face of a legend worshipped by millions, but known by so few. To the public, he was John Lennon's son, heir to an icon. But behind the closed doors of fame lay a very different story, one of loneliness, betrayal, and a search for identity that stretched far beyond music. He wasn't just fighting ghosts of the past. He was fighting the myth of a man the world refused to question. Because how do you hate the person the world calls a saint, when that person is your father? What began as a boy's longing for affection turned into a lifelong battle to be seen, not as a symbol, not as a headline, but as a human being. Behind that single confession lies a mosaic of shattered moments. A mother left to survive alone, a father who vanished into legend, and a woman, Yoko Ono, who would become both the target and mirror of his pain. In this story, we'll journey through the silence, the bitterness, the years of distance, from the last goodbye to the fragile peace that came decades later. The truth behind the Lennon name begins here, where love, fame, and resentment collide. Before the fame, before the tabloids and the burden of a name, there was simply a boy, Julian Lennon, growing up in a quiet English town, unaware that his childhood would soon dissolve into myth. To outsiders, the Lennon household shimmered with success. But within its walls, warmth was scarce. His mother, Cynthia, held the family together with dignity. Though the cracks were already spreading, John's music was consuming him, and fame was transforming him. As Beatlemania exploded, home became a ghost place, filled with noise from the outside world and silence inside. Julian remembered the sound of the door closing the day his father left. There was no explanation, no goodbye, just absence, a void that would echo for the rest of his life. Cynthia sold personal belongings to pay the bills. She smiled in public, but cried when no one could see. The glamorous world that worshipped the Beatles never noticed the woman and child left behind. For Julian, each newspaper photo of his father with someone new was another small heartbreak. Proof that the fairy tale everyone adored was built on someone else's sorrow. At school, his last name became both shield and curse. Some envied him, others mocked him. Teachers assumed the son of John Lennon needed nothing. But behind his forced smile was a boy learning that fame doesn't feed you, and love cannot be replaced by headlines. The bond with his mother became his only refuge. Fragile, tender, and quietly heroic. In Cynthia's eyes, Julian found the love he never received from his father. But in every Beatles song on the radio, he also found the wound that refused to heal. As the world sang along to Imagine, Julian was quietly living a different kind of reality, one that had no harmony at all. His father had become a prophet of peace, a face of revolution, a man whose words were quoted like scripture. But for Julian, those same words were painful reminders of everything he had lost. The world adored John Lennon, yet the boy who carried his blood could barely remember his voice. Each song on the radio was a cruel contradiction. A father preaching love while his own son grew up learning how to live without it. The concerts, the interviews, the glossy smiles with Yoko Ono. They painted a picture of devotion that never reached Julian's doorstep. When John Lennon was born, the world celebrated. Headlines called John a reborn father, a man transformed by love. But for Julian, it was the final cut. He watched from afar as the father who once walked away now cradled another child with all the tenderness he had begged for. Rumors swirled that John had once called him a mistake, that Sean was the child born of love. Whether true or not, those whispers stung deeper than any truth could. They made Julian feel invisible, a ghost within his own family history. In public, he smiled politely. In private, he carried the weight of comparison, forever the son who came first, yet always second in his father's heart. As the legend of John Lennon grew, so did Julian's isolation. The more the world adored the icon, the lonelier the son became. To millions, John was a dreamer. To Julian, he was the silence after the song ended. As years passed, whatever fragile thread still tied father and son began to fray. Phone calls were rare, awkward, almost scripted. A few letters, a brief visit, and then nothing again. John Lennon had built a new world with Yoko and Sean, and in that world, there seemed to be little space for his firstborn. Julian remained on the outside, watching interviews where his father spoke of peace and family, the same family that excluded him. Each attempt at reconnection felt forced, like strangers rehearsing affection. There were moments that gave him hope. A guitar gifted, a kind word during a brief reunion. But they always ended the same way. Silence. It was as if every expression of love had an expiration date. Then, one December night in 1980, the world stopped. John Lennon was gone, shot outside his home in New York. The planet wept for a hero, a visionary, a legend. Julian wept for none of those things. He wept for the father he never truly knew. In the days that followed, the grief around him felt almost alien. There was no funeral to attend, no chance to say goodbye. Yoko announced that there would be no public service, only a moment of peace in John's honor. Julian mourned alone, hidden behind the world's headlines. A few days before the tragedy, he had spoken to his father, a small, almost tender conversation that had given him hope for a reconciliation that would now never come. That hope died the same night John did. Months later, another wound opened. John's will was read. Almost everything, the estate, the royalties, the rights, went to Yoko and Sean. Julian's name was barely mentioned. It wasn't the money that hurt. It was the confirmation that even in death, his father had left him behind. After his father's death, the silence turned into conflict. What had once been a personal ache now became a public war. Every article, every negotiation, every whispered rumor painted Julian as the bitter son, while Yoko Ono was portrayed as the keeper of the Lennon empire, elegant, untouchable, and always in control. Behind closed doors, their exchanges were icy and strategic. Julian wanted recognition, not revenge, but each time he tried to claim his rightful place, he was met with polite dismissal, legal letters, or empty promises. She held the copyrights, the estate, the decisions, even his father's memories. In the media, Julian was accused of greed. Few understood that for him, it was never about money. It was about being erased from history, from photographs, from the story of a man he had waited all his life to understand. Every new Beatles project or documentary released under Yoko's supervision reminded him of that exclusion. His name was a footnote in the legend he should have been part of. The legal battle stretched for years, draining his spirit as much as his finances. Behind the headlines was a young man trying to reclaim not fortune, but identity. His fight was not against Yoko as a person, but against a machine built around her, a fortress of myth protecting a legacy that left no space for him. They met occasionally, cold smiles, forced politeness, eyes that revealed exhaustion more than hatred. Two people bound by the same ghost, each protecting a different version of the man they had lost. For Julian, she was the face of everything that took his father away. For Yoko, he was the reminder of everything John left behind. It wasn't war for land or wealth, it was war for truth. Time, it seems, has its own quiet way of softening even the hardest hearts. For years, Julian carried the bitterness like a second skin, familiar, heavy, and impossible to shed. But anger, no matter how justified, offers no peace. It burns everything it touches, including the one who holds it. The first cracks in the wall came through John Lennon. The younger brother he had once viewed as a rival slowly became a mirror, not of resentment, but of understanding. They had grown up in different worlds, one surrounded by privilege, the other by absence. Yet both were shaped by the same father, the same love that healed one and broke the other. Their early meetings were awkward, cautious, even painful. The air was thick with unspoken comparisons and years of misunderstanding. But beneath all that, Sean's kindness began to reach Julian in ways he hadn't expected. There was no judgment, no rivalry, only quiet curiosity and a genuine desire to connect. Through Sean, Yoko also changed, not into a friend, but into someone human, less a villain, more a widow who had her own scars to protect. When Julian exhibited his photography in New York, she attended quietly, without ceremony. For the first time in decades, there were no lawyers, no tension, just two people standing in the same room, breathing the same fragile peace. Julian realized then that forgiveness didn't mean approval. It meant release. He didn't forgive to absolve Yoko or the past. He forgave so he could finally stop reliving it. Sean became the bridge that neither fame nor blood could ever destroy. Through their bond, Julian found what he had sought since childhood. Not a perfect family, but something close enough to call his own. For most of his life, Julian had been defined by absence, the missing father, the stolen childhood, the name that belonged more to history than to him. But somewhere between bitterness and forgiveness, he began to carve out his own identity. Music had always been his first language, yet even that was complicated. Every melody he wrote was compared to John's. Every lyric was judged against the words of a man the world called a genius. Too much like his father, critics said. And when he tried something different, they said, not enough like him. The shadow was relentless. But instead of fighting it, Julian learned to walk beside it. He began exploring photography, poetry, and humanitarian work, places where his father's name meant nothing, and his own vision could finally breathe. Through the lens, he found beauty in imperfection, solace in solitude. Albums like Velat and Mr. Jordan carried whispers of his pain, but also traces of peace. His voice, warm, restrained, unmistakably his, told stories not of fame, but of survival, and slowly. The public began to see him not as John Lennon's son, but as Julian, an artist in his own right. He stopped chasing approval, stopped waiting for headlines to validate him. Instead, he built a quieter life, one of reflection, creativity, and cause. He supported environmental campaigns, helped disaster relief projects, and photographed the world not as a celebrity, but as a witness. The Lennon legacy no longer felt like a curse. It became a weight he could carry with dignity, not to imitate, but to honor in his own way. For the first time, Julian Lennon stood in the light, not as someone's son, but as himself. When Julian once said, "I truly hated her," it wasn't hatred that spoke. It was heartbreak. It was the voice of a boy who lost a father to fame, a son who spent his life untangling love from myth. The world saw anger, but what he was really saying was, "I was never seen." Forgiveness, he would later admit, doesn't erase pain. It simply stops the pain from owning you. Over time, Julian learned that healing doesn't come from closure. It comes from coexistence. You carry the grief, but you also carry grace. You remember the wounds, yet you learn to walk without reopening them. When he photographs distant landscapes now, or performs songs in small, intimate venues, there's no need for spotlights or applause. There's just presence, quiet, deliberate, real. In those moments, the shadow of John Lennon isn't something to escape. It's a reminder that even broken stories can find peace. To many, Julian Lennon will always be the son of a legend. But to those who listen closely, he is proof that identity is not inherited. It's earned. His journey from resentment to release mirrors something universal. The courage to live your own truth, even when the world insists on defining it for you. He found peace not through forgetting, but through understanding that love and disappointment can coexist, that anger can turn into art, and that silence, when embraced, can finally sound like freedom. The story of Julian Lennon isn't about revenge or reconciliation. It's about becoming whole, quietly, imperfectly, authentically. Because in the end, the greatest legacy he inherited wasn't his father's fame. It was the strength to forgive what fame destroyed,